All right, let's talk about one of the most fascinating and honestly one of the most controversial theories ever proposed about the human mind. It comes from a psychologist named Julian Jaynes, and trust me, it's going to challenge pretty much everything you think you know about your own inner world.
But let's start with a really simple question. You know that voice in your head? The one you're using right now to listen to me? The one you use to think, to worry, to make decisions? Where does that actually come from? Have you ever just stopped and considered that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't always there?
You see, most of us just assume that consciousness is this built-in feature of being human. We figure that people thousands of years ago had the same inner monologue we do. But Julian Jaynes came along and said, nope. He argued that our self-aware, introspective consciousness is actually a pretty recent invention, something our species literally had to learn.
Now, we got to be really clear here. When Jaynes talks about consciousness, he's not talking about just being awake. He means something very specific: introspection. It's that internal movie theater you have, that space where you can rewind your memories, fast forward to future plans, and basically create a story about yourself. It's the ability to think about your own thinking.
Okay, so if ancient humans weren't conscious like we are, what on earth was going on inside their heads? Well, this is where it gets really wild. Jaynes's answer is a concept he called the bicameral mind. He believed that ancient people experienced their own thoughts as if they were the voices of gods.
So the theory basically goes like this. The human brain was functionally split into two chambers. That's what bicameral means. One part of the brain, probably the right hemisphere, would generate a command when faced with a problem. And the other part, the left hemisphere, wouldn't experience that as its own thought. It would experience it as an auditory hallucination, a voice from an external source, which it would then obey, no questions asked.
Just try to imagine it. You're facing a stressful situation. Maybe a predator appears. Instead of thinking, what should I do? A voice, clear as day, just tells you, run, or pick up that rock. And this wasn't a metaphor. For bicameral man, this was a direct order from a god, or maybe a dead ancestor, or the voice of the king.
And this is the key. There was no inner debate. No, should I, shouldn't I? There was just the voice, and then the action. Jaynes argued that the entire structure of ancient societies, from their religions to their rigid social hierarchies, was actually built around this direct hallucinatory guidance system. But as you can probably guess, this unique mental operating system, it didn't last forever. A series of massive historical pressures came along and caused this whole bicameral world to start to crumble. And the voices of the gods, well, they began to go quiet.
Jaynes actually pinpoints this breakdown to a very specific period, right around 3,000 years ago, roughly 1000 BCE. This was the time of incredible chaos and upheaval all across the ancient world. You had this kind of perfect storm of factors all hitting at once. Societies were getting huge and way more complex. You had massive natural disasters, like volcanic eruptions, that just shattered the stability people relied on. Trade and warfare were forcing different cultures and their different gods to interact. And then, the real game changer, the invention of phonetic writing. The old system just couldn't handle it anymore. I mean, think about it. How does the simple, authoritative voice of your local god tell you how to handle a complex trade negotiation with someone from another land who worships a totally different set of gods? The simple commands just weren't a good enough guide for survival in this new, complicated world.
So out of the wreckage of this breakdown, a brand new mental model had to be built from scratch. And the main tool used for the job, according to Jaynes, was language itself. Language basically gave us the blueprint to build this new inner world. It gave us words for abstract ideas, a way to organize our experiences into categories, and crucially, it gave us the vocabulary to talk about our own internal feelings and thoughts. Words like mind and self. For the very first time, people could create a mental space that was totally separate from the outside world.
And a huge part of this was metaphor. Jaynes argued that metaphor isn't just a fancy way of talking, it's how we understand anything abstract. Think about it. We take something real and concrete, like a river, and we use it to understand something we can't see or touch, like the flow of time. According to Jaynes, this process is the very engine that built our consciousness.
So using these new language tools, we created what Jaynes called an analog I. It's essentially a simulation of ourselves that lives inside our heads. It's a narrated character, you, that can travel through a mind space, looking back at the past and making plans for the future. And that is the inner voice we all know so well today.
Okay, I know, this is a really out there theory. So what's the actual proof? And, just as important, what did the critics have to say about all this? Let's take a look. One of Jaynes's biggest pieces of evidence comes from looking at ancient literature. He pointed out that if you read the oldest texts, like the Iliad, the characters don't seem to have any inner thoughts. There's no agonizing or self-reflection. When a hero like Achilles has to make a big decision, a god literally just shows up and tells him what to do.
The whole debate is fascinating. On the for side, you have those ancient texts, plus modern studies of split brain patients where one hemisphere can act without the other one knowing why. But on the against side, critics say, hold on. They argue that the voices in those old stories are just a literary convention, not a real psychological state. They say hearing voices is a sign of pathology, not normal brain function. And they point to things like complex ancient tools as proof that humans have always been able to plan ahead, which seems to require consciousness.
So look, whether you're convinced by this or not, you have to wonder, why has this theory stuck around for so long? Why are we still talking about it decades later?
Well, it's because the implications are just huge. Even if the theory isn't 100% right, it gives us a completely new way to look at ancient history and the origins of religion. It offers a potential framework for understanding conditions like schizophrenia, where patients often hear commanding voices. It even makes us ask new questions about creating artificial intelligence. It really forces us to accept that our modern way of thinking might not be the only way to be human.
But really, it all boils down to this one crucial point. If Jaynes is even partly right, it means that our most intimate, personal sense of self, our very consciousness, is not some biological constant. It's more like a piece of cultural software that our brains learned how to run.
And that leaves us with one last mind-bending question. If our minds got a massive software update like that once before, who's to say it won't happen again? If consciousness was something we learned, what on earth will our minds learn to do next?